Now, I'm most interested in 4 numbers to see whether I'm on track with my metabolic health. They aren't all blood markers, and although they aren't all standard tests, they're all relatively inexpensive. And I chose those 4 because I'm trying to keep things minimal. Because I know some people now track over 100 biomarkers at once, but I prefer a much smaller set. But that still tells me something useful. And the first one is fasting insulin. And fasting insulin is not a routinely ordered blood marker by a doctor. It should be though, because if anything is off metabolically, fasting insulin is likely to be one of the first markers to be out of range. Because high fasting insulin, it points to insulin resistance. And insulin resistance comes before pre-diabetes and then diabetes. But that's when we usually hear that something is not right. When fasting glucose comes back elevated and then pointing already to pre-diabetes or diabetes. And that's why I think fasting glucose isn't that helpful as a heads-up marker, because it's usually one of the last markers to be abnormal. Fasting insulin is the upstream marker. So when something is off before fasting glucose rises, your body pumps out lots and lots of insulin to keep fasting glucose at a normal range, which is why your fasting glucose can still look normal while fasting insulin is already high in the background. And your body can do this for a very long time, sometimes for years. And that's why it's so useful to test fasting insulin, because at that stage, if only fasting insulin is high, but fasting glucose is still normal, it is much easier to reverse than when it's full-blown diabetes or even pre-diabetes. And although it's not routinely ordered, it is a fairly inexpensive test. So here in Australia, I pay under 40 Australian dollars. And even in the US, it's fairly inexpensive. That's at least what I took from Casimine's book. In Good Energy, she says literally, it's a cheap and easy test to run. Now, as in for fasting glucose, I do still track this one, but mainly because every time I get a routine checkup, it seems to be almost always included. And if you look at it as a trend over time, so if you see that it's gradually rising, even though it's still within normal range, then that can tell you that something is up. Now for the range, I do follow your Casimine's guideline. So I want my fasting insulin between 2 and 5 milli international units per liter, and my fasting glucose between 3.9 and 4.7 millimoles per liter. The next one is HbA1c, and this one is also not a routinely ordered blood marker. But once again, it is much more useful than fasting glucose, because fasting glucose is just a snapshot. It only tells you what the glucose was at the time of the blood draw. And fasting glucose can be influenced by things like how you slept the night before, what you ate the day before, recent illness, exercise, and even if you're stressed. So if you slept poorly the night before, this can affect your fasting glucose. Whereas HbA1c, it gives you your average glucose over the past 2 to 3 months. And that includes like fasting glucose and after meal spikes and everything that happens overnight. So once again, it gives you a much more complete picture. And it is a really inexpensive test. I pay under $30. As in for the range, I want mine between 5.0% and 5.4%. Now the next one isn't a blood marker. It's visceral fat. And I measure visceral fat with a DEXA scan. And here I pay about 100 Australian dollars for that. Now, a DEXA scan is the most accurate way to measure your visceral fat. But alternatively, to get a good idea still, is to measure your waist circumference. So visceral fat is fat that wraps around your organs. And it's nothing like subcutaneous fat, so the fat that sits right underneath your skin. Some subcutaneous fat can actually be metabolically protective, especially the one that sits around your hips and your thighs. Whereas visceral fat, it's hormonally active. It releases inflammatory signals that over time damages cells across multiple systems. And one of the main systems affected by excessive visceral fat is metabolism. So that's why measuring visceral fat is a really good idea to get an idea about your metabolic health. So if you get a DEXA scan, Visceral fat below 100 square centimeters means low cardiometabolic risk, but the lower the better. If you go for the waist circumference method, this is the range Cassie Means recommends. This is taken word for word from her book Good Energy. You can take a screenshot or take a photo. Now, the last number I check for metabolic health is a fairly routinely done checkup, which is triglycerides. And triglycerides are also a cardiovascular health marker. And they're basically fat in transit, so little fat packages. And if they're elevated, then this often points to things like too much alcohol, excessive calories and or refined carbs, and probably too little physical activity. Now that doesn't make triglycerides particularly different to other markers, because many markers worsen with a poor diet and inactivity and weight gain. But what makes triglycerides particularly useful is that they respond quickly to lifestyle changes. Like when you reduce alcohol intake, then you can often see changes within days or weeks. And as in for the range, I want mine below 0.9 millimoles per liter. And those are the 4 numbers I particularly track for metabolic health. Now in total, I track 12 blood markers across metabolic, cardiovascular, inflammatory, and liver health. Because once again, I try to keep things minimal and I want markers that can respond to lifestyle changes. So if you would like to get a good idea about your overall health across those areas, I actually put all those 12 blood markers into a minimal longevity lab guide. So if you want to, you can download that from my website. I will put the link in the description. But that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching and I see you in the next one.